Welcome to Mindful Moments.
You'll love mindful moments.
Oh, yeah.
It's like a deep dive for your mind, offering a refreshing perspective on everything from science and philosophy to history and art,
Wow.
all in under 20 minutes.
That's great.
Yeah?
So if you're ready to nurse your mind on the go, check out Mindful Moments via the link in the show notes. Trust me, you won't regret it.
So imagine Europe right after World War One, like the whole capitalist system as we know it, how we make money, how wealth is spread around, all of it. It looks like it's about to completely fall apart.
Wow, that's a pretty intense picture, isn't it? Yeah, so we're going to dive into what was happening in Britain and Italy just after World War One ended. For our listeners, it was a time when everything felt really uncertain. The old ways, the established capitalist order, it seemed incredibly fragile, like it could just vanish.
It's wild, right? And to understand what was going on, we've been looking at historical analysis. This stuff helps us see into what people back then were actually thinking and feeling, and it helps us see the massive forces that ended up reshaping their economies and even their political systems. A key thing for you listening is that there was this feeling everywhere back then. It was like a shared sense that the old ways, the way things worked before the war, just couldn't continue. It was broken.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what makes this period so fascinating. You had people like Willie Gallacher, and he was saying that the pre-war industrial order was basically tottering in every direction.
Yeah.
And you combine that with these just massive destruction of the war, and it really felt like things were on the brink of some huge change. And you also have to remember, during the war, governments were doing things they had never done before, taking control of the economies in ways that would have been unthinkable before. So people saw this and thought, hey, maybe a post-capitalist future is actually possible, maybe even likely. And depending on who you were, this was either a really exciting or a really scary prospect.
Oh, totally. So for people living through that time, seeing this supposed failure of the old system and then seeing how government planning seemed to work during the war, it makes sense they'd ask, well, how did capitalism survive? How did it not only survive, but actually come back even stronger than before? That's where austerity comes in, right? It's central to this whole story.
Exactly. Austerity, the way it came about then, wasn't just some boring accounting exercise. It was about pushing through a whole set of policies, a whole way of thinking. And they sold it using these simple, appealing ideas like hard work and thrift. And, while these might sound like timeless values, they actually have a long history in economic thought. You've got figures like Adam Smith, Ricardo, and Malthus who really champion these ideas.
Right, and it wasn't just theory after the war, especially in democracies where people had been through so much.
Yeah.
You're saying austerity got used as this, like, really potent political tool.
Yeah, absolutely. Think about Britain after the war. The working class had given so much during the conflict. They had put it in the work, made huge sacrifices. And through that experience, they started to realize that the social and economic order, the way society was structured, wasn't some unchangeable law of nature. So when the government then turned around and imposed these austerity measures, it was a message. It said, hey, despite everything you've done, you're expected to go back to where you were before, back to your place.
It's not hard to imagine that this didn't go over so well. I mean, the sources we looked at talk about widespread anger and resistance to these early austerity measures. It seems like the experts at the time knew this wasn't going to be easy. They knew the public wasn't just going to accept this quietly. What strategies did they use to get around that resistance?
Yeah, well, you've hit on a crucial point. Bringing back the capitalist order through austerity, they had to do it carefully. They needed a two-pronged approach. On one hand, building consensus. That meant trying to convince people, trying to sell them on the idea that these reforms were absolutely necessary. They had to convince people that these sometimes painful changes were the only way to stabilize the economy.
But it sounds like coercion played a role too, like more than just persuasion, something a bit more forceful was involved.
Yeah, you're right. They realized that people, understandably, might not make the choices they wanted. So along with trying to manufacture consent, they also had to use some coercion. And that mostly meant taking important economic decisions out of the hands of the general public.
So how did they pull that off? Like, what were the actual mechanisms they used?
Well, what they did was they started giving more and more power to these unelected technocratic institutions, especially central banks, and setting interest rates. That became huge. It had a direct impact on wages and jobs. So, the really important economic levers were being controlled by these groups that were not directly accountable to the people.
So it's like they made the shift where the return to all these capitalist norms, things like private property and the whole system of employers and employees, wage labor, they presented it as this like natural order, the only logical way to do things.
Yeah, that's exactly it. They tried to frame it as restoring the economy to some kind of natural equilibrium, rather than a political choice with winners and losers. And that's really important to understand. By making it seem like there was no alternative, they could hide the power dynamics at play. The fact that they were really just putting the working class back in a subordinate position.
Now, a lot of people might be familiar with John Maynard Keynes, especially when we're talking about economics in this period. Where do his ideas fit in with all of this?
Right, so Keynes was definitely deeply invested in protecting the capitalist system. And while his thinking about how to handle economic crises, that changed over time, but he always had this underlying worry, this anxiety about what he called the thin and precarious crust of civilization. He was always concerned about maintaining order and stability. And for you, the listener, it's really important to grasp that his main goal was always safeguarding the capitalist system, even if his specific ideas about how to do that shifted over time.
So even if he disagreed with some of the specific austerity measures, the big picture, the goal of keeping capitalism going, that was still central to his thinking. It's an important nuance.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about one really concrete consequence of all this early austerity: wage repression. Historically, and even today, you often see that when there are economic problems, the solutions that get proposed often end up putting the burden on working people.
Right, so lower wages, longer hours, cuts to social safety nets, we still hear these arguments today.
Oh, absolutely. In early austerity, it was a way to keep wages down, to make sure that those who already had wealth kept getting richer, through dividends and interest. And the impact of that, it's been huge. Just look at this statistic. The median American male worker in 2019 was actually making less in real terms, after accounting for inflation, than in 1973. That means there's been this massive transfer of wealth away from workers and towards those who own capital.
That's a pretty powerful statistic to consider, and it highlights the long-term consequences of these choices. And now, when we talk about capital, it's easy to just think of it as money, but our sources suggest we need a deeper understanding of what it really means.
Yeah, that's right. Capital, in this sense, it's not just wealth that's been piled up. There are two key things to understand. First, you have the means of production, the factories, the land, the resources. These are owned by a relatively small group of people. And second, you have wage labor. People have to work for these owners in order for them to generate more wealth.
Yeah.
That relationship, the dynamic between the employer and the employee, that's the core social relationship within this system.
And the war, with all the changes it brought about, what's called war collectivism in Britain and Italy, that really shook things up, didn't it? It blurred the lines between what was considered public and what was private.
Yes, for sure. Wartime, it forced governments to take control of all these crucial industries like munitions, energy, transportation. In Britain, they took over control of land and sea transport. Italy even went so far as to nationalize food commerce. So this war collectivism, it was a demonstration. It showed that the whole idea of private profit could be put aside if the nation needed it. And it challenged the idea that there was some fixed line between what could be publicly owned and what had to be private.
I can imagine this must have been really eye-opening for the workforce at the time. It challenged this idea of the market as some neutral, untouchable force.
Absolutely. Workers saw that their wages, their working conditions, they weren't just the result of some abstract market forces. They were the outcome of choices, decisions made by the government. A good example is, the British government. They had to prioritize national shipping needs over selling ships to foreign buyers, even though those private sales would have been way more profitable. So this government intervention in the economy, it really showed people that how production was organized. It was a political issue. It could be changed.
And the war, with so many people joining the military, that impacted the labor force too, didn't it? I mean, it messed with the whole idea of a free market for labor.
Right. The state had to step in and manage industrial relations. Sometimes they even had to suppress strikes or take action against workers to keep wartime production going. But at the same time, this period also unintentionally created conditions that helped workers organize themselves. New ways of coming together emerged, like shop stewards and internal committees. And these gave workers a stronger voice. These shifts in power are really worth thinking about. In fact, you can explore these ideas more on Mindful Moments and our podcasts, which is an AI audiobook analysis YouTube channel.
So it sounds like the war created this space for big change, but there was also a lot of pushback against that change. There was this feeling that you couldn't just go back to the way things were before.
Oh yeah, there was definitely that sentiment. Even leaders like Lloyd George, he said that going back to the old conditions was just impossible.
Hmm.
And in both Britain and Italy, you start to see moves to expand social welfare programs. And this was driven in large part by organized labor. Workers were demanding better conditions, and they were deeply suspicious of any policies that seemed to just benefit the wealthy.
So, what specific reforms did this lead to? What did those changes look like?
So in Britain, you saw these programs for building houses for heroes. There were expansions in education, more unemployment relief. And in Italy, they introduced mandatory accident insurance for agricultural workers. It was an interesting time because there was this genuine desire to improve things for workers after all they had been through during the war. But there was also this underlying goal of trying to make the capitalist system more stable, more resilient.
But in the end, as we know, austerity won out. Those more radical changes didn't happen. Why do you think that was?
Yeah, you're right. While some people were pushing for big fundamental changes, things like nationalizing the coal mines in Britain, the more powerful forces, the people concerned about government spending, and those who benefited from the old system, they pushed back hard. And the result was that wages stagnated and the labor movement found itself on the defensive. And there were these alternative models, like the building guilds in Britain, which tried to create a different way of organizing production. But these were eventually squeezed out, undermined by the lack of government support and by the tightening of monetary policy.
So, despite this initial hope for a different future after the war, in the end, the old order reasserted itself. And it doesn't sound like the working class was all that happy to just go back to the way things were.
Right. Their strikes after the war, they weren't just about wages or hours. They were about wanting a say in how production was organized, how their workplaces were run. But ultimately, austerity worked. It was successful in bringing back the old capitalist order and in shutting down these alternative visions of how the economy could be run.
It's fascinating, right? The period after World War I, it was this critical moment. It really felt like a totally different economic system might emerge. But through these carefully planned and executed austerity measures, the old order was not only saved, but actually made stronger. And the impact of that, the way it shifted the balance of power between capital and labor, we're still dealing with that today.
Yeah, and it raises this question. Are those same dynamics, that same playbook of building consensus and using coercion to push through austerity, are those still at work today, shaping our economy and our politics?
Wow, that's a huge question for us all to think about. And if you enjoyed this dive into the post-World War I world and the rise of austerity, make sure you subscribe for more critical looks at power and economics. Share this with anyone you think might be interested in understanding the forces shaping our world. And if you want to dig deeper into the source material, you can find a link to purchase it in the show notes. Most importantly, keep thinking critically about the stories we tell ourselves about how economic systems work and about who benefits from them.